Corrections for the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. And I came in that position in January 2011 along with Governor Corbett. And we're here today to talk specifically about young men of color in Pennsylvania. And you know, we live in a time now where we get uncomfortable when we talk about things like race, and I'm sure if you've watched any news lately, certainly race is in the news. But oftentimes when we have subjects like this that make us uncomfortable, we just choose to be silent about it. But I really think at this time in our history, in America in general, but Pennsylvania in specific, the cost of silence exceeds the cost to talk about things that make us uncomfortable. And there's no group that really needs attention any more than young men of color. And you see an infographic behind me that really points that out, and I'll get to that later. But when we talk about why we need to talk about this, and why the heck is the Secretary of Corrections talking about this, let me start with that. And we have been known across the country as one of the systems, the correction systems, that are really pushing reform. And we really started in 2011 by looking at how many people we had incarcerated in Pennsylvania. And Governor Corbett saying enough, saying we're not going to build our way out of it, saying that corrections is not an economic driving mechanism, but we really need to focus our system on having outcomes. And by outcomes, I mean people coming out of this system less likely to commit a crime and going in. But in that direction, and giving our department that direction, one of the things that Governor Corbett stressed was that we keep in mind the kids. And you know, that was a really smart and forward-thinking direction. And we looked at that, and how we relate to the world is by data. And we looked at that, and what we found is that 81,000 kids right now, and that's probably a low estimate, are the children of the people incarcerated in Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. 81,000. So as we are in the process of reforming the correction system, we've really done it with an eye on mitigating the impact it has on the children. And we've made significant progress. The 24 years before administration came, we saw an average growth in the Department of Corrections of 1,500 inmates a year, literally adding a prison and a half, a prison every year and a half, 24 years in a row. I'm proud to say that as I stand here today, we have 175 less inmates than we had the day we took over as administration. So we've made some progress. And it's that progress that really allowed us to focus broader and take that direction from the governor, to think about the kids and think about the kids, not the kids who are coming through our system necessarily, not just the kids who have a parent incarcerated, but the kids in general. And that's what really led us down this path. And I'll share a couple anecdotes with you. And the first one, early on in my tenure here, the Executive Deputy Secretary, Shirley Moore-Smeel, and I tour every prison every year. And we have a prison called SCI Pine Grove, which is where our young adult offenders are. So any juvenile who's detained at the state level goes to Pine Grove. And you know, walking through and talking to the inmates, the young men who are incarcerated there, is really striking. You see these baby faces, many of them aren't even thinking about shaving in the next couple years. And here they are spending the next 5, 10, 15 years locked up. And, you know, that affects you. And then when you talk to these kids, and what I've heard consistently throughout in talking to these young men, is really this. I say, why are you here? You're a kid. Why are you in a state prison? Why are you spending the next decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, the rest of your life in prison? What's going on? And an alarming number of these kids say the same thing to me. Well, Secretary, I'm going to be dead by age 25. So what does it matter? And you know, I don't know about you, but I'll, from my perspective, if I knew I was going to die in 2 years, God forbid, I'm guessing I wouldn't have a savings account, right? Because why would you? But what really that signals is a group that just has a lack of hope. And it's easy for people like me who've had opportunities and exposure to things to say, these kids should be focused on college. But if you're worried about not getting shot as you walk to school, how are you going to focus on algebra when you get there? I have a hard time wrapping my head around that. If you've never been exposed to college, college is just a word. If you've never walked on a college campus, how can you conceptualize graduating from college? And that struck me and haunted me, and obviously I've been in this field a long time, almost 25 years. And I have a lot of colleagues in law enforcement, from prosecutors to people in corrections to police officers. And we all kind of express the same thing. I wish we would have got to them sooner. There's a level of frustration, and that's not to say that once people come to us, we're writing them off, because we firmly believe in man's capacity to change, and that's why we do what we do. We take corrections literally. But what if? And this is really about what if. What if we will structure a circumstance where people never came to us in the first place? And if you look at anything about corrections, the buzz phrase you're going to see all over the place is re-entry, right? Re-entry this, re-entry that, re-entry grants. I'll tell you what real re-entry is. How about no entry? How about no entry in the county jail? How about no entry in the state prison? Heck, how about no entry in criminal justice at all? And what does that look like? That looks like reaching people before they get criminally involved. And when you look at that from that scope, at what group needs it the most, it's young men of color, period. A couple months ago, I was watching TV, and something really caught my eye. It was a press conference by the president when he was talking about this initiative called My Brother's Keeper. And it wasn't that the president talking caught my eye, because generally that kind of stuff doesn't. But the camera panned, and Bill O'Reilly and Al Sharpton were both there. Now that catches your eye, right? And when I heard about what the president was talking about with My Brother's Keeper, and ironically, it happened 2 days after I wrote an op-ed in the Post-Gazette, really saying, listen, we have to really focus on young children of color. 2 days after that, this press conference and that group, and it really struck me. And I talked about the governor signing legislation right here. The process of that legislation, that corrections world-changing legislation went through, yielded a result where every single member of the House and Senate voted yes for it. Criminal justice reform is one of those issues that whatever letter behind your name does not matter. And seeing Al Sharpton, Bill O'Reilly, I don't know if looking at it's right and left, but that right and left, at the table, both concerned, both caring about this group, both not caring about what letters behind their name, not caring what side of the aisle they sit on, leaving that crap at the door, and focusing on this group, really drove me to say, you know what, as a department, we need to have the guts to step up. And we need to have the guts to just stop focusing on just fixing corrections alone and just improving our outcomes alone, but have the real guts to reach into the community before kids are engaged and challenge people and work with people to create an environment in the community. Again, you can talk all day about corrections reform. Corrections reform will be a short-term fad if we don't get community reform. It's just that simple. The two are related, and if we don't talk about it, if we're not honest about it, and if we don't base our approach on data, 5, 10 years from now, there's going to be somebody else standing here talking about it's time to get some reform. And we're going to be in that cycle. We don't need to do that. The great part about this is that since we as an organization have been looking at this, I've had conversations with the private sector, with my friends in business, and their response has been surprising to me. The response has been, wow, I didn't really think about that. And then the next response, almost across the board, is what can I do? How can I get involved? So that leads me to believe that we have a circumstance where it's not a matter of people who don't care, who don't want to get involved. People don't understand how we get there. So when we look at anything in the Department of Corrections and in our administration, we start with data. And behind me, you'll see some data. Data that's shocking. Data that's sad, data that's somber. But data that's reflective of where we're at as it relates to young men of color in Pennsylvania today. Our head researcher, a guy named Brett Buckland, who, in my opinion, is the top criminal justice researcher, as a practitioner, it's not sitting in the ivory halls of some university, but a practitioner who's collecting data and then basing policy on the data, put this together. And the approach we take is whatever the data says, that's what the data says. And it's not about sanitizing, it's not about, hey, we want to make it look like this. It's what does the data say? And then where do we go from there? And we start, of course, because it's corrections with incarceration rate. And you may be shocked to know that 1 out of every 249 Pennsylvanians are in a state prison today. Doesn't include county jails, doesn't include federal prisons. Simply state prison, 1 out of every 249. But when we break that down by race, it really starts telling a story. And so we look at, of every white resident in Pennsylvania, it's 1 out of every 505. Every Hispanic resident of Pennsylvania, it's 1 out of every 129. But every black resident of Pennsylvania, it's 1 out of every 58. And then, when we break it down by age, the numbers almost defy logic. Young Hispanic men, between the ages of 20 and 34, literally 1 out of every 42. Young black men, same age group, 1 out of every 14. Now let's take a step back from those numbers and let's think about those kids again. Think about those 81,000 kids who are children of incarcerated parents. What we start seeing is a picture that's developing of an ever-growing group of kids who are growing up without a male parent in their life. And again, nothing I say today mitigates the fact that criminal behavior, people who commit crimes need to be held accountable. But what we need to keep in mind, and what we all agree with, I believe, is basic fairness. And the question you have to ask is that if a disadvantaged child is so seriously limited in their opportunities, is it fair? I believe the answer is no. I believe it's not fair. But I also believe that we have an opportunity to impact that. And by we, I mean every one of us. So let's look at some other numbers. We talk about this group, we talk about crime, right? Let's look at victimization. Let's look at the fact that there were 419 black homicide victims in 2011. Let's look at the fact that Pennsylvania is ranked the 4th highest in the nation for black homicide. These things are related. And then you start talking about education. And we all know the importance of education. I asked Brett, with a bit of trepidation, to look at the number of black men who got out of state prison and compare that to the number of black men who got an upper level degree beyond high school. So in 2010, we saw 7,000 approximately black men get out of state prisons across the Commonwealth. That same year, we saw only about 5,300 get an upper level degree. Folks, it's not a sustainable pattern. This is not a sustainable pattern for communities and for all of us as large. We all benefit. I say this all the time. We are all invested in the success of corrections and correcting people because we're going to release 20,000 people. We are all invested in the success of every member of our community. Every member, no matter if they're born rich or born poor or born urban or born rural. We're invested in everyone's success. And we all have a role and a responsibility. But let's look at high school education. And let's look at the graduation rate. Overall graduation rate in Pennsylvania, 83%. Black men, 67%. Hispanic, 65%. Now then let's look at dropouts, right? Because that's a large portion of people who are graduating and dropping out. The lifetime probability of incarceration for a black male who doesn't graduate from high school is 69%. Nearly 7 in 10 black dropouts will end up incarcerated at a cost of $97 a day. And we focus a lot on the numbers and we focus a lot on the money, but then when you start looking at the butterfly effect and you look at everybody who's negatively impacted, children who are growing up with a parent locked up, people who are on social receiving social services because the breadwinner is now locked up. The effect is huge, and the effect affects every one of us. You look at things like employment, and you look at the overall unemployment rate in Pennsylvania at the time that we pulled this being 8.9%, and you can certainly look up what it is today. I don't know that offhand, but you look at 19% for blacks and 16% for Hispanics, right? And we know education and employment are all related. You look at poverty. You look at a poverty rate in Pennsylvania about 13.7%, black poverty rate at 29.5%, Hispanic at 33.4%. So you look at this kind of unholy trinity that we're talking about here, and these three things, and then you look at corrections, and the rubber really hits the road. And then one other thing that we looked at and we really want to highlight is single-parent households. And when you look at the average rate of single-parent households, you look at 10% statewide, but in the black community, you look at 43.6% here in Pennsylvania and 39.9% in the Hispanic population in Pennsylvania. So we looked at the data, we looked at it objectively, we looked at outcomes, we looked at the poor outcomes, and then what's next? And Lord knows that we have a world full of problem identifiers. And frankly, one of my pet peeves is that we have a whole lot of problem identifiers, and we don't have enough problem solvers. And sometimes when we hear problems of this scope, I mean, look at the scope of what we're talking about. It's almost overwhelming, right? And you just want to go, oh my God, what can I do? I can't do anything to impact that. But that's not the case at all. Because we love clean, single, magic bullets that fix everything, but they really don't exist. There's no one big solution. It's a series of small solutions. And it's a series of small solutions by people who are engaged and who care. And it's just that simple. And to the extent that we can get more people engaged and more people who care, and more importantly, give them a path that they can show that they're engaged and show that they care, we can improve on this problem. And if we're better today than we were yesterday, then we're making progress. And the progress won't be as fast as any of us want it to be, but darn it, we're making progress. And right now, the stars are really aligning. As the stars are aligning statewide and nationally on corrections reform, the stars are aligning around this issue. And if you look at what public sector's role is, and I think it's very important that we don't always just turn to the public sector and say, fix it, because that's not going to happen. How's that working out for you? It's not. It's about partnership. It's about public sector and private sector. But public sector certainly has a role. And I think if we think of this group of young men, we think in the context of resilience. That what we really want is, and what we really need to do is build resilient young men. Because we're not going to fix all society's ills. We're not going to eliminate murder. We're not going to eliminate fights. We're not going to eliminate violence. We're not going to eliminate drugs. But can we make and help these young men to be stronger, to be more resilient, to be more apt, to be able to resist the negative impact, the trauma? You know what, argue we can. And if you look at what's going on in public sector right here in Harrisburg, we'll start with two initiatives by the governor this year, and two that are very related to what we're doing. And the first, it's called pre-K counts. Speaks for itself, right? Now what we know, and what the president pointed out, is that low-income kids literally are exposed to 30 million less words than their counterparts. 30 million. How do you make that up? How do you make up a $30 million or a 30 million word deficit? That's why the governor's pre-K counts makes sense. Improve, bolster those services, especially bolstering those services for the kids who need it the most. Because we get a big return on our investment when we focus things on this group. The second thing that the governor's doing specifically targeted at this group is called Ready by 3. And Ready by 3 is a program that focuses on getting people up or close to reading level by age 3. Or not age 3, I apologize, 3rd grade. So getting people up to reading level by 3rd grade. And again, when you look at what the data says, what the data says is about this group in particular is that when they're not reading level at age 3, they're not successful, period. And if they are successful, it's the exception to the rule, it's not the rule. So there's an example of a governor taking leadership and looking specifically at this issue, specifically at this group, the most vulnerable, and putting a focus on it and focusing it on data and investing money to get outcomes. But then look at Dave Reed and what he's doing in the House majority. They're going around the Commonwealth right now looking at poverty and declaring a war on poverty. Again, think about what feeds in. So now we have a Republican governor, Republican House. And then look at Senator Shawn Wiley from Erie. Senator Wiley is starting an initiative that is a plan for underserved and disadvantaged youth in Erie. So again, we're talking about people leaving their party at the door and focusing attention, focusing public sector resources, know-how, hearings on this group. The time is right. And the vehicle that we use for corrections reform is what's commonly known around the country as justice reinvestment. And the theory of justice reinvestment is that when we realize savings in the justice system, we reinvest that. The criticism of justice reinvestment is that when we reinvest it, all we're doing is reinvesting it back in the criminal justice system. So the question is it truly reinvestment? And that's one of the reasons why this is an issue for us, for the Department of Corrections. Because we don't disagree with that criticism. As a matter of fact, we think that the next wave, the next iteration of justice reinvestment is just that. That it's looking and finding creative ways to reinvest before someone's ever criminally involved. We're excited about the prospect. We know it's a challenge. We know no one else in the country has done it, but that's not stopped us before. That's how we relate to the world. So that's really our dog in the fight, taking this notion of justice reinvestment and saying, can we reinvest before somebody's criminally involved? We've led the